The silence before the storm, the night had fallen quietly over Washington, D.C. But inside a packed auditorium near the Capitol, there was nothing quiet about the atmosphere. Hundreds of people, from diplomats to students to journalists, had gathered to witness a special dialogue on global technology, diplomacy, and the shifting balance of power. The stage was simple, but the names on it were anything but ordinary. Sitting on one side was Jaishankar, known for his sharp words and calm posture. His presence alone commanded respect. Across from him was a panel of American lawmakers, policy experts and business leaders, and somewhere in the front row, almost hidden behind a small notepad, sat SundarPichai listening intently, his expression unreadable. It wasn't supposed to be a night that would change anything, at least that's what most people thought. It was meant to be another polite conversation about cooperation, partnerships, and shared responsibilities. But something in the air that night hinted at a different outcome, something deeper. Something that would send shockwaves far beyond the auditorium walls. Sundar had attended events like this before. He was used to hearing the usual mix of promises, critiques, and vague statements about innovation. But as Jaishankar adjusted his microphone and leaned forward, Sundar felt a quiet tension building, like the air before a storm breaks. The moderator opened the session with routine questions. Polite smiles followed, but then a young senator stood up. His tone respectful but pointed, he questioned India's rising influence in global technology, hinting that India was benefiting more than contributing. His words were wrapped in diplomatic language, but the underlying message was clear. America was growing uneasy about losing its technological dominance. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Cameras zoomed in, and Jaishankar's eyes sharpened. He didn't raise his voice, but his reply carried the weight of centuries. He spoke slowly, each word landing like a steady drumbeat. He reminded the audience that respect is not given based on power alone, but earned through contribution, responsibility, and mutual understanding. He pointed out how India had supported the global digital ecosystem, provided talent, innovation, and partnership without demanding dominance. He challenged the idea that leadership belonged to one nation alone. And then he said something that made the entire hall go silent. He spoke of dignity, resilience, and a new global confidence that refused to be underestimated. Sundar felt a chill run through him, not because of confrontation, but because of the honesty in Jaishankar's words. He had lived between two worlds his entire life, growing up in India, building his career in America, leading one of the most powerful technology companies on earth. And yet, he had often walked the tightrope between humility and pressure, between innovation and politics. Watching Jaishankar speak with such clarity struck something personal inside him. The reaction in the room was electric. Some applauded cautiously, some remained stiff, and some whispered nervously. As the night continued, the questions grew sharper. And so did the answers. Jaishankar did not flinch. He talked about the shifting global order, the importance of equality and partnerships, and the end of unquestioned hierarchies. Each statement seemed to ripple through the room. Sundar noticed the way American journalists exchanged glances, sensing a story far bigger than a diplomatic event. But what truly caught his attention was how the young students in the audience reacted. Their eyes were lit up, inspired, curious, almost proud. They were seeing someone articulate what many had felt, but never said aloud on such a stage. When the event finally ended, applause filled the hall, mixed with a lingering sense that something significant had just unfolded. Outside the building, reporters rushed to file their stories. Social media began to light up with clips from the night, and headlines started forming within minutes. But inside Sundar's car, as it moved quietly through the Washington night, his mind was not on the headlines. He was replaying Jaishankar's words over and over. Each sentence seemed to echo a challenge, not to America, but to him personally. He knew this was not just a diplomatic moment. It was the beginning of something larger, something that would pull him into its center. Whether he wanted it or not, as the car crossed the bridge, Sundar looked out at the calm water, his hands clasped tightly together. He had built his entire career on bridging gaps, solving problems, avoiding unnecessary conflict. But something inside him stirred that night, something that told him the days of staying silent on certain matters were ending. He didn't know it yet, But the storm that had begun with Jaishankar's bold words was about to pull him into a series of events that would test his values, his identity, and his courage in ways he had never imagined. The world was watching, and so was he, unaware that his reaction that night would soon become the heartbeat of a story that would travel across continents, stir debates, inspire millions, and force him to choose between comfort and conviction, between staying on the sidelines and stepping into history. And as the city lights blurred past the window, he whispered quietly to himself, not knowing why, but feeling the weight of what was to come. The silence before the storm had ended, the first wave had already hit, and Sundar was standing right at the edge of a journey that would change everything. The unexpected ripple the morning after the event. Washington woke up to a storm. It didn't see coming. It wasn't a storm of thunder or rain, but one made of headlines, trending hashtags, and conversations happening in every corner of the internet. Major news outlets ran clips of Jaishankar's speech on repeat. But what surprised everyone was the reaction from millions of viewers online. Overnight, the speech had become a viral sensation, not because of controversy alone, but because of the rare mix of truth, courage, and calm confidence it carried. It wasn't a shouting match. It wasn't staged. It was authentic. And that authenticity struck people deeply. In his hotel room, Sundar sat at a small desk, staring at the glowing screen of his phone. Messages kept pouring in from friends in Silicon Valley, from former classmates in Chennai, from journalists asking for comments, and from employees who had watched the speech and felt inspired. He had always been careful with his public reactions, never rushing, always weighing every word. But this time, something felt different. He wasn't just a spectator anymore. The world was looking at leaders in technology, asking where they stood, and his silence was starting to look like a statement of its own. His team called early in the morning, their voices sharp with urgency. They told him that several American senators had reacted strongly overnight. Some praised the speech, others criticized it, calling it confrontational. Analysts debated endlessly about whether this marked a new phase in international relations. Meanwhile, students and young professionals across the world flooded social media with clips of Jaishankar's words, adding their own stories, their own emotions. It was no longer just a diplomatic dialogue. It had turned into a movement of shared pride and global reflection, and Sundar, whether he liked it or not, had been pulled into its current later that afternoon. Sundar attended a quiet lunch with a few senior American business leaders. It was meant to be informal, but the air carried a different tone, one of cautious curiosity and hidden tension. They asked him what he thought of Jaishankar's remarks. Their eyes studying his every expression, Sundar chose his words carefully, acknowledging the honesty and clarity of the message while emphasizing the need for cooperation and respect. But inside, he was aware that every sentence he spoke was being mentally recorded and interpreted. He had always navigated such rooms with precision, but today it felt like walking through a field of invisible tripwires after the lunch. He stepped out into the crisp air and paused for a moment on the steps of the building. He watched people walking by, carrying coffee cups, talking on phones, unaware of how fast the conversation was shifting around them. Sundar's phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from an old professor in India. It simply read, "The world is finally listening. Don't let it pass." Those words hit him unexpectedly. Stirring a quiet restlessness inside him, he had built bridges all his life, but maybe now it was time to strengthen one side, to stand a little taller as evening approached. He returned to his room and opened his laptop, scrolling through the endless flood of reactions. One clip caught his attention. It showed a young Indian student in New York, speaking emotionally about how hearing Jaishankar gave her courage to speak up in her own academic circles. She spoke about feeling seen, respected, and empowered for the first time. Sundar paused the video midway, leaning back in his chair. Something about her raw honesty reminded him of his own student days. The long nights in hostel rooms, the quiet dreams of making a difference. But just as he was lost in thought, a message from his communications team broke through. An influential senator had indirectly mentioned his name in a televised discussion. Questioning where global tech leaders truly stood in moments like these, the clip was already circulating widely, and comments were piling up, some supporting him, some accusing him of staying neutral for too long. The pressure was mounting fast. Sundar knew that once his reaction became public, It would shape not just his image, but also the way millions interpreted this moment. As the night deepened, Sundar stood by the window. Looking at the distant glow of the Capitol building, he felt the weight of his unique position more intensely than ever before. He wasn't just an executive anymore. He had become a symbolic bridge between two worlds that were slowly redefining their relationship. Every decision he made now carried ripples far beyond boardrooms and campuses. And for the first time in a long while, he realized that silence might not protect him this time. It might define him, somewhere deep inside. He sensed that the ripples had only begun, and soon they would become waves strong enough to force him into the center of the storm. Not as a spectator, but as a voice that could shape the direction of the tide. Whether he was ready or not, the pressure behind closed doors. The following day began long before the sun had fully risen. Sundar sat in a quiet corner of a dimly lit conference room in his Washington hotel. Surrounded by a small circle of advisors and communications experts, the air was thick with tension. They were going over every headline, every tweet, every panel discussion that had emerged overnight. The story had evolved quickly. Now it wasn't just about Jaishankar's bold words. It was about how influential figures were reacting, and Sundar's name had started appearing in editorials, op-eds, and online debates. Not because he had spoken, but because he hadn't. His silence was beginning to echo louder than any speech. His head of communications leaned forward, her voice measured but firm. She explained that they were receiving hundreds of media requests for a statement. Some wanted him to support Jaishankar openly. Others expected him to take a neutral, diplomatic stance. A few even hinted that staying silent could be seen as cowardice. Sundar listened carefully, his fingers interlocked on the table. He had dealt with crises before, but this wasn't a product issue or a business deal. This was something deeply human, cultural, and political. It demanded more than polished words. It demanded clarity of heart. As the meeting went on, one of his senior advisors, a man who had worked in Washington for decades, spoke in a low voice, reminding him that open support could have consequences. There were senators, policymakers, and business groups watching closely, ready to interpret every phrase. He warned that taking a strong stance might strain certain relationships that had taken years to build. Sundar nodded. He understood the weight of those words. But deep inside, a quiet conflict was brewing, one between the man who had learned to navigate carefully and the boy who had grown up believing in quiet courage. By midday, Sundar moved to another meeting. This time with a group of young tech professionals and students who had requested a private conversation. They had gathered in a modest co-working space near Georgetown, away from the noise of formal events. Their energy was different, vibrant, unfiltered. They spoke with passion about what Jaishankar's words had meant to them, how they felt seen and respected, how it gave them a sense of belonging in spaces where they often felt overlooked. Sundar listened silently, their stories sinking deep into him, reminding him why he had chosen to work in technology in the first place, to connect, to empower, to bridge. One young engineer told him how he had watched the speech with his parents back in India, and how for the first time his father said, "Maybe the world is beginning to hear us." Another student spoke about facing subtle discrimination in academic spaces and how the speech had given her the courage to speak up. Sundar didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. Their words carried a power he couldn't ignore. And as he stood to leave, one of them looked straight at him and said softly, "Your silence means more than you think." Those words lingered like a shadow as he walked out into the cold afternoon air. Later that evening, Sundar found himself sitting across from two influential senators in a private dinner room. The conversation started politely, with small talk and soft laughter, but slowly turned sharper. One of them leaned in and asked directly what he thought about the speech and the wave of reactions it had triggered. The question hung in the air like a blade. Sundar chose his words with care, speaking of collaboration, shared responsibilities, and the importance of understanding different perspectives. But he noticed how both senators exchanged a glance. As if weighing his every syllable, he knew they were searching for a clear sign, a position, a line in the sand after dinner. Sundar walked alone along a quiet street, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement. Every step echoed with the questions he had avoided answering directly. The young people's voices played again in his mind, blending with the subtle pressure of power from the dinner table. Two worlds pulling at him from opposite directions, and for the first time, he realized that this wasn't just a moment he could sidestep. It was a turning point, a quiet but powerful demand for clarity from both sides. Back in his room, he sat by the window again. The same view of the Capitol building now felt heavier, like a silent reminder that history often unfolds in quiet rooms before it bursts into the open. He opened his laptop and drafted a few lines. Deleted them, then wrote again. Each sentence felt like a delicate thread. One wrong word, and it could unravel everything. His heart and his mind were at odds, and somewhere deep inside, he knew he couldn't delay forever. The world was waiting. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, unaware that tomorrow's events would corner him in ways he hadn't yet imagined, forcing him to confront the very core of who he was and what he truly stood for. The breaking point. The next morning began with an unexpected call that would set the tone for everything that followed. Sundar's assistant knocked softly on the hotel door, holding a phone with a serious look. A senior White House official wanted to speak with him. The conversation was brief but layered with quiet intensity. The official politely mentioned that recent developments had caught the administration's attention. They valued his contributions as a global tech leader, but they hoped he would make a statement that encouraged unity and avoided anything that could further complicate the narrative. The tone was diplomatic, but the message was clear. They didn't want his voice to strengthen the wave of bold sentiments rising after Jaishankar's speech. They wanted calm, control, and predictability. After the call, Sundar sat still for several minutes, staring at the muted TV where news channels played endless loops of debates, panelists dissecting every word, speculating about alliances, shifts, and silent signals. His name flashed repeatedly in tickers. Will SundarPichai speak out? Tech titan's silence raises questions. He had spent his entire career avoiding political storms, focusing on innovation and building, not speeches and ideological statements. But this was different. This storm was coming to his doorstep. Whether he opened it or not, midday brought an unplanned meeting with a group of Indian diplomats and thought leaders who had gathered in a quiet hall away from the media. The room buzzed with quiet determination. They saw the speech as a defining moment, something that could reshape how the world viewed their nation's voice. They spoke passionately about how influential figures like Sundar could help carry that message forward, how his reaction could inspire millions. Sundar listened carefully, but every word they spoke added to the weight already pressing down on him. He admired their conviction, but he also saw the sharp edges of expectation. They were looking at him not just as an individual, but as a symbol, and that frightened him more than he wanted to admit later that afternoon. He walked into a press briefing arranged for a different topic entirely, but reporters were no longer interested in product updates or company initiatives. The first question thrown his way was direct and heavy. Do you support Jaishankar's bold remarks that are currently reshaping diplomatic conversations? The room fell silent. Dozens of cameras zoomed in. Microphones leaned closer. Every eye locked onto him. Sundar's heartbeat quickened. He had prepared statements, but none of them felt right anymore. The lines his team had crafted sounded hollow in his head compared to the voices of the young people he had met. The quiet plea in their words, the hope in their eyes, he answered cautiously, speaking of the importance of respect, global cooperation, and the role of technology in connecting people rather than dividing them. He emphasized shared values and mutual growth, but he didn't directly address the core of the question. As he spoke, he could feel the subtle shift in the room. Reporters exchanged quick glances, sensing the careful neutrality in his tone. Some nodded politely, others looked dissatisfied. The moment he stepped off the stage, social media exploded. Some praised his balance, but many criticized him for avoiding a firm stance. Headlines labeled his response as measured, safe, and non-committal. The storm had only grown louder. That night, Sundar avoided all meetings and sat alone by the large window. The city below was alive with lights and noise, but his mind was elsewhere. Caught between his personal truth and his public image, he thought about his childhood in Chennai, where his parents taught him quiet strength and humility. He remembered the excitement of arriving in America, carrying nothing but dreams and determination, and how he had built everything by working quietly, letting results speak louder than words. But now the world wasn't asking for results. It was asking for his voice, His phone buzzed with a message from a trusted mentor. The words were simple but powerful. You can't stay at the edge forever. Silence is also a choice. Sundar read those lines again and again. They unsettled him, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Every hour he remained silent. The world was defining his position for him, interpreting his hesitation as either fear or indifference, neither of which reflected who he truly was as the clock approached midnight. Sundar made his way to the rooftop terrace of the hotel. The air was cool. The city stretched endlessly in front of him. He stood there quietly, feeling the wind on his face, thinking about the millions of young minds watching, the policymakers waiting, the journalists writing, and the quiet sense of responsibility that had followed him his entire life. Somewhere deep inside, something shifted. It wasn't a loud decision, but a silent clarity, a realization that if he didn't shape his own narrative, someone else would do it for him. He returned to his room with a heavy but focused heart, knowing that tomorrow could no longer be like today. He didn't yet know the words he would choose, but he knew he had to speak. And that decision alone marked the beginning of a very different kind of journey, one that would test him not as a CEO, but as a man standing at the crossroads of history. The voice within, the morning sun, broke through the thin curtains of the hotel room, casting soft golden light on the floor. Sundar sat at the edge of the bed, his elbows resting on his knees, his fingers pressed together in silent thought. The decision to finally speak had settled inside him during the night like a quiet flame. It wasn't loud or impulsive. It was steady and undeniable for years. He had let his work speak for him, believing that building bridges through technology was enough. But now the world wasn't asking for code, products, or policies. It was asking for clarity of heart. And that realization carried both weight and freedom. He started the day by canceling most of his scheduled meetings, something he rarely did. He needed space, silence, and time to gather his thoughts. His team noticed the change immediately. Their usual fast-paced strategy discussions were replaced by calm but serious faces. They sensed he was about to do something different, something that would not be drafted entirely by communications experts. His head of communications tried to suggest carefully worded statements again, but Sundar gently stopped her, explaining that this time, the words needed to come from him. Unfiltered, not as a CEO, not as a diplomat, but as a human being who had lived between worlds as the morning stretched on. He walked alone through the quiet streets near the National Mall, away from cameras and officials. The autumn breeze brushed against his face as he looked at the monuments that had witnessed countless moments of courage and transformation. He thought of his early days in America, of the small student apartment, the endless nights of study, the quiet sense of belonging and displacement intertwined. He thought of India, of his parents who had taught him dignity without noise, humility without weakness, and strength without arrogance. And somewhere between those memories, he began to find the words he needed by midday. He gathered his closest advisors and informed them that he would make a public statement that evening, not through an interview or a corporate press release, but through a live address streamed directly online, unedited and unscripted. The announcement sent a ripple of shock through his team. They knew this was uncharacteristic of him, but they also saw the quiet determination in his eyes, the kind that couldn't be negotiated away. News quickly leaked to the media, and within hours, headlines across the world lit up, SundarPichai to break silence in live address. The anticipation was electric. Millions waited to hear what he would say as evening approached. He sat alone in the green room of the small studio they had set up. The lights were soft, the cameras quiet. The teleprompter screen in front of him remained blank. He didn't want scripted lines, just his thoughts. His heartbeat echoed in his ears, faster than usual, but it wasn't fear. It was the weight of finally stepping forward. He closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the young engineer who told him, "Your silence means more than you think." And the mentor's message? Silence is also a choice. Both voices merged into a single truth. When the broadcast began, the world watched in silence. There were no grand introductions, no polished corporate visuals. Just Sundar sitting alone, speaking softly but firmly. He began by acknowledging the extraordinary moment the world was witnessing. He spoke about Jaishankar's words not by analyzing them, but by recognizing the courage they represented. He spoke of his journey, of belonging to two worlds, and how he had learned that respect is not built through power alone, but through honesty, resilience, and shared growth. He reminded viewers that technology, at its core, was not about dominance but connection, and that voices of dignity deserved to be heard, not dismissed. His words flowed not as rehearsed statements, but as lived experiences. He didn't take sides in a way that alienated anyone, but he also didn't hide behind neutrality. He expressed admiration for the clarity with which Jaishankar had spoken and highlighted the importance of listening to emerging voices with genuine respect. He spoke of cooperation that wasn't one-sided, of partnerships built on equal footing. His tone was calm but carried an unshakable conviction, and as he spoke, millions of viewers around the world felt a quiet shift. When he finished, he didn't end with applause or grand gestures. He simply folded his hands, thanked the viewers, and left the screen. The broadcast lasted less than 15 minutes, but its impact was immediate and enormous. Social media erupted with reactions. People called it authentic, brave, and deeply human. Commentators praised his balanced yet powerful stance. Young professionals felt seen, while diplomatic analysts debated the ripple effects his words would have on future conversations. For the first time in days, Sundar didn't feel like he was reacting to the storm. He felt like he had finally spoken into it. Later that night, he walked onto the rooftop again, the cool wind carrying the sounds of the city below. But this time, his heart was lighter, not because the pressure had vanished, but because he had chosen his path. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Praise, criticism, or both. But he knew he had spoken his truth. And that, for him, was enough. What he didn't know yet was that his speech would set off a chain of events far bigger than anyone expected, pulling him even deeper into the shifting tides of history. The turning tide, the morning after his address, felt strangely still, as if the city itself was pausing to absorb what had happened the night before. Sundar stood by the window, looking down at the streets where life moved on in its usual rhythm. But the world beyond was buzzing. His speech had crossed borders within hours, translated into dozens of languages shared by students, diplomats, business leaders, and everyday people alike. Some called it a moment of quiet courage. Others described it as a turning point where a bridge finally spoke for itself. But amidst all the noise, Sundar felt a deep calm inside, a sense that he had finally aligned his voice with his values. His team entered the room early, faces lit with a mix of exhaustion and amazement. Overnight analytics showed unprecedented global viewership. Millions had tuned in live, and tens of millions had watched the replay before dawn. The most surprising part wasn't just the scale of attention, but the nature of the responses. Instead of polarized outrage, there was thoughtful conversation, respectful debate, and a wave of personal reflections from people across continents. His words had not ignited a fight. They had sparked something quieter and more enduring, a collective moment of introspection. By midday, invitations began flooding in. Universities, policy forums, and international summits wanted him to speak. Analysts debated his influence in shaping not just technological futures, but cultural dialogues. Some political figures criticized his stance, accusing him of stepping into territory that wasn't his, while others privately reached out, acknowledging the depth his words had added to the ongoing discourse. His statement had unsettled the usual rhythm of polite diplomacy and scripted corporate distance. It had introduced honesty, and honesty always stirred the waters in the afternoon. Sundar attended a closed-door roundtable with international students and young innovators, many of whom had traveled across the country just to meet him. They spoke about how his words had resonated deeply, giving them courage to carry themselves with quiet pride in spaces where they often felt like outsiders. One young woman from Kenya told him that his speech made her realize that dignity doesn't always need to be shouted. It can be spoken softly and still be heard. Another young man from India said he had shared the speech with his father, who wept quietly after watching, saying, "This is the world I always hoped you would grow into." Sundar listened with humility, realizing that what had started as a moment of hesitation had transformed into a source of inspiration for people he had never met. Later that evening, he attended a private gathering with several global business and political leaders. Some approached him with cautious respect, others with veiled criticism. One prominent figure questioned if his speech might strain certain partnerships. Sundar responded with quiet steadiness, explaining that partnerships built on mutual respect only grow stronger when honesty is involved. He didn't posture or challenge anyone. He simply spoke with the same authenticity he had shown the night before. The room shifted subtly. People began to see him not just as a technology executive, but as a voice capable of bridging complex worlds with grace. As the night wore on, Sundar found himself on a quiet balcony overlooking the city skyline. The noise of the world far below, his thoughts drifted to the journey of the past few days. From the first moment he sat in the audience listening to Jaishankar's words, to the storm that followed, to the quiet decision to finally speak, and now to the ripples his voice had created, he thought about his parents in Chennai, who would be sitting together watching the replay, proud in their quiet way. He thought about the students who saw a reflection of themselves in his journey, and he thought about the weight that had lifted off his shoulders when he chose clarity over silence. He knew challenges would follow, moments where his stance would be tested again, perhaps even criticized more harshly, but something within him had shifted permanently. He had crossed a line that he didn't want to step back from. Not a line of division, but a line of courage. His voice, once carefully held back, had found its place in a conversation far larger than himself, and it was not going to fade as the wind moved gently across the balcony. Sundar whispered to himself that this was only the beginning. The tides of history were shifting, not through force or fear, but through quiet strength and honest words, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was standing between two worlds. He felt like he belonged to both, not as a mediator forced to choose, but as a man who carried the spirit of both within him. The night deepened, the city lights shimmered, and somewhere across the world, young voices repeated his words, carrying them forward in ways he could not predict. The storm that had once surrounded him had transformed into a current, not of chaos but of change, and Sundar, quietly but firmly, was now part of that tide.